Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
This conversation is called The Blessed Box. I'm dying to know what box we're talking about, Mike.
Oh, we're talking about a very special box indeed, as far as the Israelites were concerned. We're going to be looking today at the Ark of the Covenant, a box that was hugely symbolic for Israel and that played some very significant roles in its history and some significant roles in the incidents that we're going to be looking at today.
You mentioned the Ark of the Covenant. I've got Indiana Jones in my mind.
Yeah, that's the trouble, isn't it? So much of our Bible reading is coloured by movies or cartoons or so on. So, yeah, perhaps we just better be clear about this. First of all, there was no inherent power in this box at all, contra the movies and all that they show there. But nonetheless, it symbolized something very, very powerful. The Ark of the Covenant was without doubt Israel's most sacred religious artifact. It had been constructed according to instructions that God had given to Moses at Mount Sinai, along with the giving of the law. What it was a wooden box made of acacia wood, a box or a chest. It was just over a metre long, 1.1 metres long, about 0.7 metres wide and high. But this box was covered with pure gold on the inside and the outside. It had legs with rings on it, which poles passed through so that it could be carried by the priests. But perhaps one of the most important parts of it was its lid or its cover. It's actually called the atonement cover in most Bibles. It sometimes translated in older versions as the mercy seat. And on this lid of the box were two large gold cherubim, angelic figures with outstretched wings reaching out towards one another. And those outstretched wings at the point where they met in the middle symbolized the very throne of God here on earth. So it was a very, very special place. It was kept initially in the tabernacle. The word tabernacle simply means dwelling place. It was God's dwelling place, God's tent at a time when the Israelites were living in tents as they journeyed from their former slavery in Egypt to their homes in the Promised Land. Later it would be kept in the temple, and inside this box, we're told, were kept the tablets of the Ten Commandments, a jar of the manna, the food that God had miraculously provided on the journey, and Aaron's rod that budded. So this was a very special, very holy artifact indeed, and it was seen as, how can I put it? It was seen as the point where heaven and earth touched. There's a verse in Exodus 25, verse 22, where God says there, above the cover, between the two cherubim that are over the Ark of the Testimony, or the Ark of the Covenant, I will meet with you. This was the meeting point of heaven and earth, and so was hugely important, symbolic of God's presence among his people. So we find, for example, that the Ark of the Covenant had a very special place. So when Israel was camped in those years in the wilderness, the Ark was right at the center with the 12 tribes camped around it. When the Israelites were on the move, the Ark was right at the front, leading the way. You remember it was carried by the priests as they crossed the River Jordan, we saw in a previous episode. It had been there when Joshua renewed the covenant between God and the people in the Promised Land after the reverse of the defeat at Ai, when he read the law to the people again. So everything about this box said holy, God's presence, blessing. It was a very, very special, blessed box indeed.
I was struck by the fact that you know the dimensions of it. And I'm thinking back to, for example, when the ark with Noah had these very precise dimensions.
Yeah.
And even actually in that recent conversation we had about Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, how many times they had to walk around the city there. So God seems to be very interested in detail.
Yeah, absolutely. And the detail of the dimensions you can find in Exodus chapter 25, and everything's measured out very precisely indeed. And it's as if, God does care about the details. He didn't say to Moses, oh, listen, and I want you to make a box that we can put the 10 Commandments in, sort of make it look pretty, because it's quite important, isn't it? He gives very precise details in all of these things. And as you said, the building of Noah's ark, a very different type of ark there. God cares about the details, and it's very important that Israel follows these to the letter. This is part of their holiness. This is part of living differently. This is part of being a people who will do things God's way. And if we can't make a box to the dimension God tells us to, then how on earth are we ever going to do the bigger issues in life that God talks to us about?
I'm very keen to ask you a bit more about the contents. You said the stone tablets, a jar of manna, and I thought manna rotted after time, and this budded rod or staff from Aaron. Just give us a bit more detail on that.
Yes, we find that listed actually in the New Testament, in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 4, where it records the Jewish tradition of what was contained there. Now, the commandments were written on 2 stone tablets. Now, we often think, by the way, of those stone tablets, 5 on one, 5 on the other. Going to any church with stained glass windows that's got Moses with the 10 Commandments, and sure enough, you'll see there's 5 on one and 5 on the other. Not so. All 10 would have been on both. Because what used to happen in the ancient world, whenever a covenant or a treaty, to use a different word, was made between 2 kings or 2 nations, there would be 2 copies of the treaty made exactly the same, and a copy given to each king as a way of saying, now remember what you have committed yourself to. But here, when God makes a covenant with his people, it's as if he's saying, listen, there is nothing you can bring to the party, nothing you can do to make this covenant work. This is all of me. So because I'm making this, because it's me that's dealing with you and your sin and bringing you in to make you my people, I'll keep both copies rather than one each. And therefore, both copies of the stone tablets were kept inside the Ark of the Covenant. It was a constant reminder the covenant was God's doing. It was his gift. It was only his spirit and his enabling that enabled people to come into it and to walk by it. Still is today, by the way. The only way we can come into a covenant relationship with God through Jesus is by believing that God did it all for us through Jesus when he died on the cross. So both copies are there as a way of a reminder. This is God's doing. A jar of the manna kept. You're quite right. We're told that if they tried to keep it overnight, it rotted, except when they gathered it on the day before Sabbath, and then God miraculously preserved it for 2 days, so they would have enough for the Sabbath and not need to work on the Sabbath day. So, humanly speaking, it ought to rot after 1 day, but God could preserve it for the 2nd day. So why could God not preserve this eternally within this vessel, within this jar that was there as a reminder of his provisions? The 10 Commandments is a reminder of his covenant. The jar of manna is a reminder of his provision. Aaron's rod, a reminder of his power, his ability to make a way through, because of course it was Aaron's rod and Moses' rod that had been used so often to bring about the miracles that God wanted. And Aaron's rod in particular had budded when there'd been debate about who should be the priests. And there were some who were thinking that Aaron was getting a bit above himself in claiming the priesthood, and they'd Well, Moses had said, well, look, let's put our rods before the Lord. Aaron can put his rod before the Lord's tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, and those who think they should be priests can put theirs there, and whoever's rod buds, that will be the one that the Lord has chosen. And it was Aaron's. So there was a reminder too of not just, if you like, the power of God, but the priesthood that God had given as the go-between between this holy God and the sinful people. It did need a go-between, just like we need a go-between today in the person of Jesus and his priesthood and sacrifice for us. So 3 very significant things here in terms of thinking about God's covenant and God's provision, and God's provision of a priesthood to enable people to come to him, all contained here within this very blessed box.
Therefore, that blessed box would have had such a significance for the people that there's almost a danger it could be worshipped. It could almost become like a relic.
And sadly, that is what happened. Now, clearly it had been used at very significant points in Israel's history. We've said it was held by the priests in the middle of the Jordan when they crossed over and so on. And so the danger is that what one starts to think is, hang on a minute, whenever the ark is around, there's blessing. And what happened gradually in Israel's history, particularly over the next sort of 300 to 400 years, because after Joshua had taken the land after his death, Israel was led for a season by what we call judges, who were really tribal leaders. There was no real cohesiveness over that period of about 325 years. And over that period, it looks like the Israelites slowly began to trust in the ark of God rather than the God of the ark. And we're going to look at a surprise today where that comes to light. And I think the huge challenge for us as we listen to it is, whenever God has used anything or given anything that is an incredible blessing to us, to be careful to not let our focus come on that which God has given or that which God has used in the past. And that's where we get into the whole thing of church relics, where rather than them being things that turn people's eyes to God, people go around the whole world to look to the particular relic and think it is in that blessing can be found. Well, today's story will show us that that's really not the case, and we really need to be careful so that we don't let our focus become on the things of God rather than the God of things.
So where do we find that particular story?
Well, we're going to look today in the first book of Samuel, chapter 4 and 5. So we've just jumped ahead a little here through that period of the judges to this sort of betwixt and between phase between the judges and when Israel has its first king. And it's still been led by a sort of prophet come priest called Eli, and the one he will train up called Samuel. And in chapter 4, we find an example where the Israelites have clearly got a wrong expectation of what this ark would do. So maybe we should just read a few of those verses. Now, this particular story concerns a group called the Philistines. So let's just talk about them. Philistines lived in 5 sort of city-states up along the Mediterranean coast at the southern end, going down towards Egypt. And at this particular period in Israel's history, they were becoming particularly powerful. They'd emigrated to that area but had grown and developed and were trying to push inland to take further territory that they felt they needed. And of course, that brought them into clashes with Israel, who were in that land. So chapter 4 begins with the Israelites going out to fight against the Philistines, and the Philistine deploying their forces, and there's significant battle going on at this point. And then let's pick it up from verse 3. It says, when the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines? So clearly they'd lost heavily. Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that it may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies. Just note the wording there. We've been defeated. What we need is the ark, so it may go with us and save us. They've already let their focus start slipping, haven't they?
Superstition almost.
Well, it is. It's really become very little more than that, hasn't it? So they send to Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant has been for many years now. And we read that when the Ark of the Lord's Covenant came into the Israelite camp, when they brought it back, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. And hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, what's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp? So clearly now, the Israelites have thought the presence of this blessed box is going to bring a blessing. And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. A god has come into the camp, they said. We're in trouble. Nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? Because these are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the desert. Interesting, they knew about that, isn't it? Be strong, Philistines. Be men, or you'll be subject to the Hebrews as they've been to you. Be men and fight. So clearly here, the Philistines too are so convinced this is a blessed box that they feel that's it. There is no hope for them. But then we read, so the Philistines fought and the Israelites were defeated. And every man fled to his tent, and the slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers, and the ark of God was captured. Oh my goodness. So what's happened here? This blessed box suddenly seems not to be so blessed after all, doesn't it? The presence of God doesn't seem to have been powerful enough to overcome this Philistine army. And actually, when Eli, the priest come judge, hears about this at the end of chapter 4, he is so shocked by this news that the ark has been captured that by now an old man, it says he fell off his chair and he broke his neck.
So this blessed box seems to be proving to be problematic.
It does, doesn't it? And it's going to get even more problematic in the chapter that follows. And if we can do a little play on words here, the blessed box will become a blessed box. You know, we sometimes use, that blessed thing, when we mean the very opposite. And we find the very opposite happens in 1 Samuel chapter 5, where there's a whole number of surprises for the Philistines, who discover that the ark brings them nothing but trouble. So the first thing that they do, remember the Ark of the Covenant, we said, was Israel's most sort of holy, precious artifact, and the Philistines had captured it. So what are you going to do with it? You're going to take it, you're going to put it on display somewhere, aren't you? You're going to show, look at us, look how great we are, look at what we did. And so they do that, and they take it to one of those 5 cities that the Philistines were based in, a city called Ashdod, and they put it in the temple of their particular god, Dagon, who was a grain god. And they put it there at its feet as a way of saying, yeah, Israel's God is subject to ours. But when they wake up the next morning, they discover that the statue of Dagon has fallen over, and, quick, they, get everyone together. Quick, get the guy back up, get your duster out. Let's rub his nose again, beck him back up and put him in place. But they then come in the next morning and discover that not only has the statue fallen over, but this time the heads and the hands of the statue have broken off. And even worse, it says tumors started appearing among the people. There's some sort of rapid spread of disease now. Was it something that tumors suggest? Was it something like plague? Because clearly it's something that appeared rapidly overnight, that spreads quickly among the people.
So they could be thinking this blessed box is unlucky.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't blessed, but it was blessed. And so what they decide to do from the city of Ashdod is they go to one of the other Philistine cities in Gath and sort of say, hey, we've had the box quite a while now. It's only fair that we share it around, isn't it? We think you guys should have it for a while. So it's sent to Gath. What happens in Gath? Again, there's an outbreak of tumours. Then Gath says to Ekron, hey, we've had the box quite a long time. Maybe you guys should have it. Exactly the same thing happens again, and the people are thrown into panic. So it goes from Ashdod to Gath to Ekron. And after 7 months of this, of passing it around between them, the Philistines gather their priests and their diviners to try and find out what they should do. And the message is clear. This box has become a blessed box. And we need to get rid of it, and we need to send it back to where it came from, to Israel.
But you said right from the beginning that the box itself doesn't have any inherent power.
Yeah. So why was it falling over? Not because of magic in the box. This was God establishing his credentials. You see, all these gods of the Philistines, at the end of the day, they were either gods of regions or gods of spheres. So Dagon was a god of the grain and the harvest. But here is Israel's God, the Lord, Yahweh. And the Bible is very clear. He's not a regional God. He's not a geographic God. He's not a God of the mountains or of the seas or of the lowlands. He is the God of the whole earth. So here is God himself establishing his credentials before all the other so-called gods of the Philistines. It's not the box that did it. It wasn't like you see on the movies, the box pulsating and power coming out of it, and in the Indiana Jones movies, all the Nazis getting killed who tried to take it. No. If you'd gone in and looked at it, you wouldn't have seen anything happening. It wasn't the box of God that was doing it. It was the God of the box. This was God at work, presenting his credentials as the Lord of the whole earth, every part of it, God over all gods. It was God, not the box.
But presumably the Philistines were glad to see the back of it.
Oh, absolutely. And we get the story of that in chapter 6 of 1 Samuel as they gladly send it back to the Israelites. So what they decide to do is they get a brand new cart made, fresh, new, didn't want any dirt on it. It's a holy artifact. They understand that. And they put alongside it what's described as 5 golden tumors. Why tumors? Well, remember, they'd been inflicted with tumors. So these were almost like peace offerings. Why 5? Well, 1 for each of the 5 key Philistine cities as an offering to this god. And they send it pulled by oxen, and it arrives at a place called Beth Shemesh in Judah, which was right on the border between the two territories. And as it gets back, there's obviously great rejoicing amongst the Israelites as they see this blessed box coming back to them again. And the Philistines say, look, we'll let these cattle go off on their own. If it goes this way, we'll know God's not happy with us. If it goes that way, we'll know he is. Well, it goes that way. They know there can be peace at last. And then the people of Beth Shemesh are in the middle of harvesting the wheat when they see it. And it says, when they looked up and saw the ark, they rejoiced at its sight. So great rejoicing. The blessed box is back. But then something happens. We read that 70 men decided to look inside the box. So while some are rejoicing and they chop up the cart and make a fire of it and kill the oxen that are carrying it to make an offering to the Lord. So they're doing the right thing. They're rejoicing that God has sent this blessed box back to them. But we read these sad words. God struck down some of the men of Beth Shemesh, putting 70 of them to death. because they'd looked into the ark of the Lord, and the people mourned because of the heavy blow that the Lord had dealt them. And the men of Beth Shemesh said, "Who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? To whom will the ark go up from here?" So they had forgotten what this box was about. It had just become a box, an object, and there is irreverent curiosity here. And they decide, I've always wanted to have a look inside. Shall we have a look? What's in it? Come on, David, let's take a look. And they lift the lid to look inside. And it's again not because at that moment some power zoomed out and burnt them all up like in the movies. It's because of their irreverence. This was a holy artifact. This symbolized the very throne of God. And they get it. Because those who survive say, "Who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God?" So the blessed box had become a blessed box. It came back to be blessed. For these 70, it was blessed again. But the Israelites realize once again, it is a blessed box. But you know what? They don't know what to do with it. They're not quite sure. And so what they end up doing is sending messengers to a place called Kiriath Jearim, saying that the Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to your place. So the men of Kiriath Jearim came and took the ark of the Lord. They took it back to Abinadab's house on the hill and consecrated Eleazar, his son, to guard the ark of the Lord. So now, rather than going back to the tabernacle at Shiloh where it ought to have gone, it's left on someone's mantelpiece. Well, it would have been a very big mantelpiece, wouldn't it? But you get the picture. It's left in someone's front room with a priest's son to look after it. Why? Because, well, they've realized this blessed box is blessed, but you've also got to be very careful with it because it represents a very holy and powerful God who doesn't want to be trifled with.
And as time went on, were there still problems in the future with it?
Yes, there would be. The interesting thing, there's a very similar thing will happen in the reign of King David. David was really keen, godly man. And when he became king, he was really keen to put God at the center of his kingly rule. And one of the things he wants is to bring back the Ark of the Covenant from this room of the house of Abinadab in Kiriath Jearim, to bring it to it seems like a special tent he had made for it rather than the tabernacle as such. But he wants it brought to Jerusalem, which he has just recently captured and made his capital city. Very shrewd, because it was right on the border of the northern tribes and the southern tribes. And so he has this brand new capital and he wants God there at the center. And so he sends for the Ark of the Covenant. And here's an interesting thing. He sends for it and has it brought on a brand new cart. Now, where has he got that from? He's got it from this story that we read today. They'd remembered that's what the Philistines had done, and they'd done exactly the same thing. And so they brought it on a brand new cart. Of course, the Lord said what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to carry the ark with those poles that were attached to it, carried by priests. And so as this ark is being brought into Jerusalem on this brand new cart, drawn by oxen, there's a hole in the road. And the wheel dips down into the hole and the cart kilters to one side, and it looks like the ark is going to drop off. And there's a guy called Uzzah in 2 Samuel chapter 6 who does something I think pretty instinctive. He just reaches out to stop the ark from falling onto the ground. But the Bible says the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act, and God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of the Lord. You think, oh my goodness, this is a bit heavy, isn't it? The poor old guy was only trying to prevent an accident from happening. But of course, God had said very clearly how this had to be carried. And in fact, David's very angry, the story goes on to say. He was very angry because of the Lord's wrath had broken out. And it's not until he comes to realize what he has done wrong that they can bring the ark back as it's meant to be carried, with the priests carrying it on their poles. And as they've taken the first few steps, David then stops them and offers a sacrifice of thanksgiving to God. So it could prove to be a very troublesome, a very blessed box, as well as a blessed box, if it wasn't dealt with properly.
So if one of the lessons to be learnt is to move the reverence for the box of God to the God of the box, how do we apply that to ourselves today?
I think there's a whole number of places where we can apply. Churches sometimes are not very good at keeping traditions they ought to and letting go of traditions they don't need. And sometimes people can get so worked up about a particular object rather than what it serves. I will never forget, as a young man in my first year when I went to seminary, to London School of Theology, in London, UK. And as part of our outreach, I was part of a music group that used to go out and do sort of gospel singing and preaching and so on. And we went to one church and we needed just to set up our instruments at the front. And we moved the communion table just back so we had enough room for the instruments and the music. And there was one of the deacons at this church was livid that we had moved the communion table. This communion table has stood there for so many years and you have moved it. And he was outraged. He was angry with us. And I was thinking, I'm sorry, I'm finding it really hard to see why it is that you are so upset. You can still take communion on this table. It's only been moved back a couple of feet or whatever it is. But it's not just him. There are many of us perhaps who get stuck on our artifacts in our church. The number of arguments churches have had about whether you can take pews out and put chairs in, whether you can get rid of the hymn books and have songs projected from a PowerPoint instead and include modern songs with it, or whatever it might be. Sadly, Christians at times, whether individually or corporately, can get very stuck on the things of God rather than the God of things. Do you know what? The things are only there to help point us towards God. They are not God, no matter how much of a tradition and how much blessing they have. And we certainly have nothing today like the Ark of the Covenant. Our Ark is now a spiritual Ark, a spiritual presence. And I would find it very difficult indeed to go through the New Testament and find any reference to anything or even any place being holy. What is holy is wherever the Holy Spirit is and whatever the Holy Spirit is doing. So for me, the lesson out of this is don't end up getting so focused on the things of God that you miss the God of things. Don't let a blessed box become a blessed box.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.